From the author of Spinsterella, the strange and unusual romance and spellbound, a darker shade of black comes the legendary Magic Children. Pick up the conclusions of the Spinsterella trilogy in paperback and e-readers this Halloween. You'll often hear a lot of comic fans making videos talking about SJW Marvel and how they're upset about Marvel Comics creating these diversity characters and shoehorning them into lead roles. And they'll sit there and some of them will praise DC Comics talking about how Rebirth is so great. But what a lot of people don't know about DC Comics is that DC Comics itself was in its own state of decline, and one of the reasons why DC Comics is in a state of decline right now and is still struggling is because Dan Dido decided he wanted to create his own agenda for DC Comics, and part of that agenda was creating some SJW diversity heroes for the DC Comics brand back in the mid-2000s. Now, in the mid-2000s, we saw DC Comics go on its own diversity campaign by taking several popular characters who were white and replacing them with minorities. But because these characters were second-tier characters, most people didn't really think about it as an SJW agenda. And these characters like Firestorm, Blue Beetle, the Atom, the Question, they all had followings, but because they were second-tier characters, people couldn't see that DC Comics was going on an SJW campaign and pushing identity politics with their characters, because the way these characters were presented and put in as diversity heroes was almost the exact same way Marvel Comics implemented their diversity campaign by taking popular characters who were white, killing them off, or murdering or eliminating them in some sort of fashion, or marginalizing them like they did with Ray Palmer, and then replacing them with minority heroes, all in the name of diversity. And when I look at your DC Comics, they were clearly guilty of using the same identity politics as SJW Marvel, but most comic fans won't call them out for using the exact same agenda or pushing the exact same narrative as Marvel Comics, because when I look at the Black Firestorm who replaced Ronnie Raymond, I clearly see an SJW diversity agenda. When I look at Jamie Reyes, who replaced Ted Kord as Blue Beetle, again, I see the same SJW agenda. And when I see the female Question, Renee Montoya, who replaced Vic Sage, I see the same identity politics and the same diversity campaign. And the reason why I see that is because of the way they treated Ryan Choi when Ryan Choi became the Atom. Because when Ryan Choi became the Atom, he became extremely popular. A lot of people liked Ryan Choi as the Atom. He was starting to build a following as a character, and he was starting to gain momentum as a character. But what did DC Comics do when Ryan Choi started to get popular and started to get over with fans? They killed Ryan Choi because they didn't want this Asian character to be the equal of Ray Palmer, the white character. So that clearly shows me the racism behind the SJW agenda at DC Comics. But most people won't call it out again because they think that their diversity was different in some ways, but it was actually the exact same thing that SJW Marvel was doing, a passive-aggressive attempt at diversity where they introduce these characters of color and then hope that these characters of color fail so they can go out and say that, oh, we tried to bring diversity into the comic book industry, but no one bought the books. And this is what they want to do with these SJW agendas, really, is that these racist liberals want to be able to say, oh, we brought in characters of color, but because the characters of color were executed a certain way, it didn't sell. And because it didn't sell, we can't do characters of color. And in actuality, it's all about them being passive and saying, we introduce these characters of color, but aggressive in the execution of the concept. And the reason why the execution of this concept is passive-aggressive is because all we have to do is look at DC Comics Mr. Terrific to clearly show us what happens when you implement diversity properly. Because Mr. Terrific, the original one, was a white guy, and then he got the mantle passed to Michael Holt in an organic fashion in the pages of Justice Society. And because the mantle was passed in an organic fashion to Michael Holt in Justice Society, people accepted Michael Holt as Mr. Terrific, and a lot of people love Michael Holt as Mr. Terrific. They do not like Jason Rush as Firestorm because he was a shoehorn diversity character. They did not like Jamie Reyes as Blue Beetle because he was a shoehorn diversity hire. They didn't like Renee Montoya as the Question because it was a shoehorn diversity character. And they did not. The only reason why they liked Michael Holt and Ryan Choi is because both of those characters came into the roles in organic fashions. But unfortunately, in the role of Ryan Choi, they decided they were going to kill this character off because he was getting too popular. And a lot of people will look at SJW Marvel and call them out for their identity politics, but they won't call out DC Comics for their identity politics. And this is where Marvel really got many of its ideas from, was your DC Comics. Because when I look at Marvel these days, they have been copying DC Comics quite a bit. And the first way they did was with this SJW agenda. The other way they did was with the reboots related to Secret Wars and the reboot to All New, All Different Marvel. And those two reboots were meant to parallel DC's New 52, its convergence, and its recent rebirth. So I'm looking at Marvel these days, and the reason why Marvel is in a state of decline is because Marvel decided they wanted to follow down Dan Didle's dysfunctional road, not seeing that Dan Dido literally destroyed the DC Comics brand with his mismanagement of that brand, because in 2011, when he decided to implement the New 52, it led to the complete collapse of DC Comics, a collapse that had been building over the last 7-8 years due to his years of mismanagement and his implementation of stories like Identity Crisis, a story I would never have approved of because it just is a disgusting story, your Infinite Crisis, Final Crisis, and many other stories, which literally led to many DC Comics fans walking away from the brand. And then once he implemented the New 52, many comic fans walked away completely from DC Comics, and the damage was so extensive to the DC Comics brand that it did damage to the point where it was damaging DC's own merchandising. I remember hearing many comic fans on numerous boards saying they weren't even buying action figures or any other merchandise related to DC as long as this New 52 was in place. And even with the convergence and the rebirth, many people have walked away from the DC Comics brand, and it is nowhere near as popular as it was back before Dan Dido took over the DC Comics as editor and publisher over there. And a lot of people will look at Marvel and say, oh, Marvel's bad under Axel Alonso. No, DC is just as bad under Dan Dido, Jim Lee, and Bob Harris, and Diane Nelson as Marvel is under Axel Alonso and Tom Beveridge, because both companies have been mismanaged by a group of guys who just don't understand the publishing business, and they don't know how to lead a publishing brand and navigate and manage a publishing brand. And both guys have been following each other. And when I look at Axel Alonso and Tom Beveridge, it's just dysfunctional to me to sit there and see them go out and follow a path down Dan Dido's road, seeing that Dan Dido's road destroyed DC Comics. And thanks to them following down that road, it has led to the complete, almost near collapse of the comic book industry, because he decided to follow a model that led to DC's decline and copy it instead of saying, we'll stay on our own road and do our own thing. Because before Marvel decided to go on this SJW road and this Secret Wars reboot road, they were doing pretty well. But then they decided to go down this road and follow Dan Dido's dysfunctional path, and that led to the complete near collapse of the comic book industry, because they decided they wanted to follow down DC's dysfunctional model and put these SJW characters in, and now they're trying to get things right with this new event. And I don't think it's going to work at this point, because I look at the sad state of affairs of the comic book industry, and the comic book industry's editors and managers don't see how many people they have alienated, they don't see how many people they have turned off, and they don't see the long-term damage they have done to these brands, because you already had one foot in the grave with your median age being 40 years old, and you're at a point where the kids may not come back into the hobby, because at this point the marketplace is so damaged and so shattered that you're not going to be able to really bounce back, because kids now have, it's a different world. Kids have different options, and they have options that are better for them for their entertainment value per dollar than a $5 comic book with 32 pages in it. And I look at the state of the comic book industry, and people talk about SJW Marvel. They really need to look at the predecessor to SJW Marvel, which was SJW DC, because DC Comics was the one who implemented many of these ideas before, but everybody just looks at Marvel and yells at them without looking at DC and seeing the equal dysfunction on the DC Comics side. This is why I say both Marvel and DC need new management and need new leadership, because both companies have clearly been mismanaged into the ground by people who never came from comics, or people who don't know anything about the publishing business. If you'd like to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. And if you'd like to try some of my SJS Direct titles, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.